September 2, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. Across America, celebrations erupted in every city and town as the war that had consumed the nation for nearly 4 years finally came to an end. In prisoner of war camps from California to Texas, Japanese soldiers prepared for repatriation to their defeated homeland. But in a small facility outside Camp Stoneman, California, something unprecedented was unfolding in the women's section of the compound. When American personnel served lunch that day to a group of 38 Japanese women prisoners, the meal included something that would challenge everything these women believed about their captors. Corned beef with cabbage and potatoes, fresh bread with real butter, cold milk in glass bottles, and for dessert, apple pie still warm from the oven. The women stared at their metal trays in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the Japanese Women's Auxiliary Service, captured during the final months of the Pacific Campaign. Young women who had served the emperor in various capacities as radio operators, nurses, translators, and administrative personnel, now facing a reality that contradicted every piece of propaganda they had been taught. What could possibly make someone trust food from an enemy they had been told would torture and kill them? Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. 24-year-old Yuki Tanaka sat frozen before her meal tray, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the table. She had been a communications officer in the Imperial Japanese Army, stationed in the Philippines, when American forces overran her position in July. For 2 months, she had been in American custody, moved from one facility to another, always waiting for the brutality her commanders had promised would come. The other Japanese women at her table looked equally uncertain. Keiko Yamamoto, barely 21 years old, had tears in her eyes as she stared at the generous portions. She had been a medical assistant and had not seen this much food on a single plate in over a year, even before her capture. The youngest of 6 children from Osaka, she had joined the auxiliary service to ease the burden on her struggling family. Harumi Sato, at 27, the oldest of the 3, maintained her military bearing despite the confusion written across her face. An administrative clerk from Kyoto, she had been raised in a traditional family that valued discipline and duty above all else. She had been taught that Americans were demons who would show no mercy to captured Japanese, especially women. Yet here they sat, looking at more food than they had seen in months, served on clean trays by Americans who had not struck them, not starved them, not done any of the terrible things they had been warned about. Sergeant Thomas Martinez, the head cook, stood near the serving line watching the women's reactions with a mixture of understanding and sadness. A Mexican-American from San Antonio, he had faced his own share of prejudice and understood what it meant to be seen as the enemy. He had insisted on preparing a substantial, wholesome meal for the women, despite some objections from other personnel who felt enemy prisoners deserved nothing more than basic rations. The story begins 6 months earlier, in March 1945, when the first group of Japanese women prisoners arrived at the California facility. Unlike the massive camps that housed thousands of male prisoners of war, this smaller compound had been hastily constructed to accommodate the unexpected capture of women auxiliary personnel. The 38 women ranged in age from 19 to 32, captured across various Pacific islands as American forces advanced toward the Japanese homeland. They had served as radio operators, nurses, translators, and administrative staff for the Imperial Japanese Army. Their capture had been as unexpected to them as it was to their American captors, who had little experience managing female enemy prisoners. Captain James Wheeler, assigned to oversee the facility, remembered the March morning when the transport trucks arrived. The women climbed down with rigid military posture, their faces carefully blank masks hiding whatever terror they felt inside. They wore remnants of their khaki auxiliary uniforms, some torn and stained from weeks of jungle combat and retreat. Many were malnourished, their faces gaunt from months of dwindling rations even before capture. Among them was Yuki Tanaka, who clutched a small cloth bag containing the only possessions she had managed to keep, a photograph of her family in Tokyo, and a broken radio component she had been trained to repair. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary in 1943, believing she was contributing to Japan's defense and honoring her family's samurai heritage. Now, standing in an American prison camp, she felt the weight of failure pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The initial weeks were marked by profound silence and mutual suspicion. The Japanese women kept to themselves, communicating only in whispered conversations during designated times. They followed camp routines with mechanical precision, their faces revealing nothing of their internal fear and confusion. Captain Wheeler noted how they maintained perfect military discipline even in captivity, standing at attention whenever American personnel entered their barracks, never making eye contact, never asking for anything beyond basic necessities. The women had been thoroughly indoctrinated with stories of American brutality. They expected torture, starvation, perhaps worse. Some had been given cyanide capsules before deployment, though these had been confiscated upon capture. They had been taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death, that Americans showed no mercy to Japanese prisoners, especially women. Yet as days turned into weeks, the promised horrors never materialized. They were given adequate barracks with real beds and blankets. They received regular meals, though the food was strange and unfamiliar to their palates. They were allowed to wash and maintain basic hygiene. Medical personnel treated their injuries and illnesses without cruelty. The cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing created a profound internal conflict that left many of them in a state of confused numbness, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The first real breakthrough came in late April, 6 weeks after the women's arrival. The incident involved food, though not in the way anyone expected. The women had been eating the meals provided to them, but only out of survival necessity. They touched nothing that looked unfamiliar, picking only at rice when it was offered, and leaving most American dishes untouched on their trays. The waste troubled Sergeant Martinez, not because of the food itself, but because he recognized the fear behind their refusal. One evening, Keiko Yamamoto sat in the mess hall, staring at her dinner tray with visible distress. The meal included meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, none of which she recognized. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She had barely eaten in 3 days, subsisting only on small portions of bread and water. But her training had been explicit about the dangers of accepting enemy food. What if it was poisoned? What if it was designed to make them weak or compliant? Private Daniel Murphy, a 19-year-old kitchen assistant from Iowa, noticed her trembling hands and the way she looked at the food with desperate longing mixed with fear. He had a younger sister back home, just about Keiko's age, and something about the young woman's obvious distress moved him to action. Without asking permission from his superiors, he walked to the kitchen and returned with a clean plate. In full view of Keiko and the other watching Japanese women, he took portions from the serving line identical to what had been given to the prisoners. Then he sat down at a nearby table and began eating, making sure they could see every bite he took. He chewed slowly, deliberately, showing no ill effects. After finishing half his plate, he smiled gently in Keiko's direction and said in a soft voice, even knowing she likely could not understand his words, "It's just food. Plain old American cooking. Nothing special, nothing dangerous. Just food to keep you healthy." Keiko watched him with wide eyes, her medical training allowing her to observe that he showed no signs of distress or illness from eating the same meal. Slowly, hesitantly, she picked up her fork. Her hand shook as she brought a small bite of mashed potatoes to her lips. The creamy texture and buttery flavor were unlike anything she had tasted before, but it was not unpleasant. She took another bite, then another. Around her, other women watched this small act of courage with intense focus. If Keiko did not become ill, perhaps the food truly was safe. Private Murphy finished his meal and stood to return to his duties, but not before offering Keiko a respectful nod. She did not return the gesture, her training forbidding such familiarity with the enemy, but something in her rigid posture softened ever so slightly. That night, for the first time since their capture, most of the women finished their dinner portions. It was a small victory, but it marked the beginning of something neither side had expected: the possibility of trust between enemies. May brought warmer weather to California, and with it, subtle shifts in the atmosphere of the camp. The Japanese women had begun eating regular meals, though they still maintained careful distance from their American captors. But food had opened a door that neither side fully understood yet, creating opportunities for small moments of connection that gradually accumulated into something more significant. Sergeant Martinez noticed that several of the women watched the kitchen operations with obvious curiosity during meal preparation times. Their barracks windows overlooked part of the outdoor cooking area, and he often caught them observing how American meals were assembled. One morning, he made a decision that would surprise even Captain Wheeler. He approached Harumi Sato, the oldest of the women, and the one who seemed to hold informal leadership among the prisoners. Through Corporal Sarah Chen, who spoke limited Japanese learned from her own grandmother, Martinez conveyed a simple message: would any of the women be interested in helping in the kitchen? The request was met with suspicious silence. Helping their captors seemed like collaboration, a betrayal of their duty as Japanese servicewomen. But Harumi recognized something deeper in the offer. Idle hands and empty hours were destroying morale among the women. They needed purpose, needed to feel useful rather than simply warehoused like forgotten cargo. After consulting quietly with Yuki and Keiko, Harumi gave a careful nod of acceptance. The next morning, 5 women, including all 3, reported to the kitchen for duty. Martinez started them on simple tasks: washing vegetables, peeling potatoes, measuring ingredients. He demonstrated each task clearly, using gestures and simple words, never raising his voice or showing impatience when they did not immediately understand. What surprised him was their intense focus and precision. These women approached kitchen work with the same disciplined attention they had brought to their military duties. Within days, they had memorized routines and began anticipating next steps without being asked. Yuki discovered she had an aptitude for understanding recipes. Even when written in English, she could barely read. The mathematical precision of measurements and timing appealed to her communications training. Keiko's medical background made her naturally cautious about food safety and hygiene, earning Martinez's respect for her careful practices. Harumi observed everything, learning not just cooking techniques but also American customs and interactions. But the real transformation happened during the small conversations that began to emerge. Private Murphy taught them English words for different foods: potato, carrot, onion, bread, butter. They taught him Japanese terms in return: jagaimo, ninjin, tamanegi, pan, bata. The exchanges were halting and often accompanied by laughter at mispronunciations, but they represented something profound. These were no longer just enemies sharing space. They were human beings sharing knowledge, finding common ground in the universal language of preparing food to nourish others. The women began to smile occasionally, small expressions quickly hidden, but unmistakably present. The Americans started to see them not as abstract enemy soldiers, but as individual people with personalities, talents, and dignity that deserved respect. December 1944 brought an unexpected challenge to the camp. Captain Wheeler had been wrestling with how to handle the holiday season, knowing that many of his Japanese prisoners were likely experiencing profound homesickness and depression. The war news from the Pacific was grim for Japan, and the women had received no word from their families in months. Some had begun showing signs of dangerous despair. Sergeant Martinez proposed something radical: a proper Christmas dinner for everyone in the camp, prisoners and personnel together. The idea met resistance from several staff members who felt it inappropriate to celebrate an American Christian holiday with enemy prisoners. But Wheeler recognized the deeper purpose. This was not about religion or victory. It was about affirming the humanity of everyone in the facility during a season that emphasized peace and goodwill. The preparations became a collaborative effort that transformed the entire camp's atmosphere. The women who had been working in the kitchen threw themselves into the preparations with unexpected enthusiasm. Martinez taught them how to prepare traditional American holiday dishes: roasted turkey with herb stuffing, mashed potatoes with gravy, sweet potato casserole, green bean almondine, fresh baked rolls, and cranberry sauce. For many of the Japanese women, these were completely foreign foods, but they approached learning the recipes with the same dedication they had once brought to serving their emperor. Yuki took charge of organizing the dining hall, arranging tables in a way that mixed prisoners and personnel rather than segregating them. It was a bold choice that reflected how much had changed in the 9 months since their arrival. Keiko helped prepare medical accommodations for anyone who might react poorly to the rich, unfamiliar foods. Harumi worked directly with Martinez on the turkey preparation, learning the intricate process of seasoning and roasting the large bird to golden perfection. On Christmas Eve, the dining hall had been transformed. Simple decorations made from paper and pine branches created a festive atmosphere. The long tables were set with actual plates rather than metal trays, cloth napkins instead of paper. When the prisoners and American personnel gathered that evening, the usual tension had been replaced by something approaching anticipation. Captain Wheeler offered a brief, carefully worded welcome that acknowledged the unusual nature of the gathering. He spoke of hope for peace, of gratitude for the year ending without further loss of life in their small community, and of the basic human need for connection and kindness. Corporal Chen translated his words into Japanese, her voice carrying the emotion behind the message. Then the food was served. The Japanese women's eyes widened at the abundance placed before them. Whole turkeys carved at the table, steam rising from dishes of vegetables and potatoes, baskets of warm bread with butter that melted on contact. For women who had experienced months of wartime rationing even before their capture, the sight was almost overwhelming. Keiko's hands shook as she accepted her plate, tears forming in her eyes at the realization that their captors were sharing their own holiday bounty with prisoners who had so recently been trying to kill them. The new year of 1945 brought devastating news that would shatter the fragile peace the women had found in their captivity. As American forces advanced across the Pacific, liberating territories occupied by Japan, reports began filtering back about the conditions they discovered. Stories of prisoner-of-war camps where Allied soldiers had been starved and brutalized, accounts of civilian populations subjected to systematic cruelty. Evidence of atrocities that most ordinary Japanese citizens claimed never to have known existed. Captain Wheeler had debated whether to allow the Japanese women access to American newspapers and radio broadcasts reporting these discoveries. Some advisors argued that exposing them to such information might create dangerous unrest or provoke suicide attempts. But Wheeler believed that truth, however painful, was necessary for genuine transformation. In late February, English-language newspapers were made available in the camp library, and Corporal Chen was authorized to provide translations for those who requested them. Yuki was among the first to seek out the news reports. Her English had improved dramatically over the months, enough to read the accounts from liberated camps in the Philippines and Burma. She sat alone at a library table, her face growing paler with each paragraph she read. The photographs were grainy but unmistakable. Emaciated Allied prisoners, mass graves, facilities designed for systematic torture. These were not propaganda fabrications. These were documented facts, witnessed by American forces and international observers. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, reading survivor testimonies about years of starvation rations, forced labor, and casual brutality from Japanese guards. Some of the locations mentioned were places she had transmitted communications to and from during her service. She had helped coordinate logistics for facilities where these atrocities occurred. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Keiko found her there 2 hours later, tears streaming silently down Yuki's face. The younger woman picked up one of the newspapers and began reading. Within minutes, she too was crying. Her medical training made the descriptions of deliberate starvation and untreated diseases especially horrifying. She had believed she was serving in a medical capacity to help her countrymen. Now she understood she had been part of a system that inflicted deliberate suffering on helpless prisoners. Other women gradually gathered around the newspapers, their expressions moving from confusion to horror to something resembling grief. These were not hardened militarists or devoted ideologues. They were young women who had joined auxiliary services believing they were defending their homeland from aggressive enemies. Now they confronted the possibility that their country had been the aggressor, that the stories of Japanese superiority and righteous war had been lies built on foundations of cruelty. Harumi sat apart from the others, staring at a photograph of liberated American prisoners who looked like skeletons wrapped in skin. She thought about the generous Christmas meal the Americans had shared with their Japanese captives. She thought about Private Murphy, demonstrating that their food was safe by eating it first. She thought about Sergeant Martinez, patiently teaching them cooking skills rather than assigning them degrading labor. The contrast between how Japan had treated its prisoners and how America treated theirs was impossible to ignore. The revelations about Japanese war crimes created a crisis of identity among the women prisoners, but it also sparked an unexpected transformation. Rather than retreating into denial or despair, many of them sought ways to make amends for actions they had unknowingly supported. The camp kitchen became the center of this transformation, a place where former enemies worked side by side to create something nourishing rather than destructive. Yuki threw herself into learning everything about American cooking with an intensity that surprised even Sergeant Martinez. She had always been methodical and precise, skills that served her well as a communications officer. Now she applied that same discipline to mastering recipes, understanding ingredients, and perfecting techniques. Martinez noticed how she took careful notes in a small journal, writing down recipes in a mixture of English and Japanese characters. She was not just learning tasks, she was studying a craft with the dedication of someone seeking redemption through competence and contribution. Her transformation was remarkable to witness. The woman who had arrived 9 months earlier, rigid with fear and indoctrination, now moved through the kitchen with confidence and purpose. She began suggesting modifications to recipes based on available ingredients, showing creative problem-solving that impressed the American staff. More importantly, she started teaching other Japanese women who volunteered for kitchen duty, passing on both culinary skills and her growing English vocabulary. Keiko found her calling working alongside Dr. Elizabeth Foster, the camp physician. Her medical assistant background made her valuable in the small infirmary, but it was her gentle manner with patients that made her indispensable. She learned to change dressings, take vital signs, and provide comfort to both American personnel and Japanese prisoners who fell ill. Dr. Foster began teaching her more advanced nursing techniques, recognizing genuine talent that deserved development. The young woman who had once prepared medical supplies for Japanese military operations now dedicated herself to healing anyone who needed care, regardless of nationality. She studied English medical terminology with the same intensity Yuki brought to recipes, determined to communicate effectively with patients. When a severe flu outbreak struck the camp in March, Keiko worked 18-hour days without complaint, moving between beds with tireless compassion. Her actions during that crisis earned respect from even the most skeptical American personnel. Harumi discovered unexpected skills in administration and organization. Captain Wheeler enlisted her help managing camp records and coordinating work assignments for the Japanese women. Her attention to detail and natural leadership abilities made her an effective liaison between the prisoners and American command. She helped resolve conflicts, translated not just words but cultural misunderstandings, and ensured that both groups understood each other's needs and expectations. The three women had become essential to the camp's daily operations, but more importantly, they had found meaning in their captivity. They could not undo their past service to a regime whose crimes they now understood. But they could choose how to live in the present, could choose to contribute rather than simply exist, could choose to build bridges rather than maintain walls between former enemies. August 15, 1945. The day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender changed everything for the women at Camp Stoneman. The war that had defined their entire adult lives was over, and with its end came questions that none of them were prepared to answer. What did they want to do now? Where did they belong? Who were they without the structure of military service and national purpose that had shaped their identities? Captain Wheeler received orders from Washington regarding repatriation procedures for all Japanese prisoners of war. Transportation would be arranged within 8 weeks. The women would be processed through occupation facilities in Japan before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes and families. For most prisoners of war, such news would bring relief and joy. But for the women at Camp Stoneman, the announcement created profound anxiety and uncertainty. Reports from occupied Japan painted a grim picture. Cities lay in ruins from firebombing campaigns. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been destroyed by weapons of unimaginable power. Millions were homeless, starving, struggling to survive in the devastated landscape. The social order that had governed Japanese life for centuries had collapsed along with the military government. Women who had served in auxiliary forces faced particular stigma. They would be viewed as failures who had dishonored themselves through capture. Traditional Japanese society offered no place for women who had been prisoners of enemy forces. Whispers of forced prostitution and social exile awaited those who returned. Many families would refuse to acknowledge daughters or sisters who had survived captivity rather than choosing death. Yuki sat in the kitchen after dinner service one evening, staring at her journal filled with carefully copied recipes. She had written to the International Red Cross months earlier, trying to locate her family in Tokyo. The response had finally arrived that morning. Her parents and younger brother had been killed in the March firebombing of Tokyo. Her older sister's fate was unknown. She had no home to return to, no family waiting for her arrival. The recipes in her journal represented the only future she could imagine, a path forward built on skills learned from her former enemies. Keiko faced a different, but equally painful situation. She had received word that her family in Osaka had survived, but her father's letter made clear that she would not be welcome to return. The shame of her capture and survival had made her an unbearable burden to a family already struggling with poverty and social stigma. Her father's words, translated by Corporal Chen with visible discomfort, essentially disowned her. She wept quietly in the infirmary where she had found purpose and acceptance, realizing that the Americans who had been her captors showed her more compassion than her own family. Harumi had received no news at all from Kyoto. She did not know if her traditionalist family had survived or if they would accept her return if they had. The uncertainty was in some ways worse than knowing. But she recognized that her 9 months in American captivity had changed her in ways that would make returning to traditional Japanese life nearly impossible. September 10, 1945. Captain Wheeler called a general assembly for all Japanese prisoners to formally announce repatriation procedures and timelines. The 38 women gathered in the mess hall, with expressions ranging from resignation to barely concealed dread. Wheeler had prepared his remarks carefully, working with Corporal Chen to ensure accurate translation of the complex information. But before he could begin his official announcement, Yuki Tanaka stood up slowly, her posture straight, but her hands visibly trembling. In clear, careful English that reflected 9 months of dedicated learning, she addressed Captain Wheeler directly. "Captain, may I speak for some of us?" Wheeler nodded, surprised but willing to hear what she had to say. Yuki looked around at her fellow prisoners, making eye contact with Keiko and Harumi before continuing. "We have been discussing among ourselves for many weeks. Some of us, we do not wish to return to Japan immediately. We know this is an unusual request, but Japan is no longer our home. The Japan we served, we have learned, was not the Japan we believed in." The words hung in the air like an explosion. Several American personnel exchanged shocked glances. In the entire history of American prisoner of war operations, no one had encountered enemy captives requesting to remain rather than accept repatriation. Keiko stood next, followed by Harumi and 11 other women. 14 women total, nearly half the camp's population, had reached the same impossible conclusion. Anna spoke in halting English, her medical training giving her courage to voice painful truths. "Captain, we have written to families. Some families are dead. Some families say we bring shame. We have nowhere to return to. But here, you have shown us kindness we did not deserve. You have taught us skills. You have treated us with dignity, even as enemies." Harumi added her voice to the request, her natural leadership evident in her composed delivery. "We understand we are prisoners of war. We understand we have no right to ask this. But we wish to learn more, to contribute more, to become better people than we were. If we return now to Japan, we return to nothing, worse than nothing. We return to shame and rejection." Captain Wheeler was genuinely speechless. He had anticipated many possible responses to the repatriation announcement, but not this. The legal and bureaucratic implications were staggering. These women were still technically enemy nationals, still classified as prisoners of war despite the end of hostilities. The Geneva Convention made provisions for their repatriation, but included no framework for voluntary extended detention or immigration. Yet their appeal touched something deeper than legal procedures. These were human beings who had undergone genuine transformation, who had been shown an alternative to the militaristic society that had shaped them, and who now desperately wanted to embrace that alternative rather than return to a homeland that no longer existed in any meaningful form. Private Murphy approached Wheeler quietly after the assembly. "Sir, these women aren't our enemies anymore. They're just people caught up in something they never fully understood. Sending them back to face rejection and shame seems cruel after everything they've been through here." The bureaucratic wheels turned slowly, but Captain Wheeler's urgent communications to Washington eventually produced results. The War Department, faced with an unprecedented situation, created a special classification for the 14 women who wished to remain. They would be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war, making them eligible for sponsorship and potential immigration status. However, this meant they would no longer be guaranteed housing or support at the military facility. They needed American families willing to sponsor them, provide housing, and help them find employment. The response from the local California community surprised everyone. The Patterson family, who owned a farm near the camp and had supplied produce for the kitchen, immediately offered to sponsor Yuki. Margaret Patterson had met her during kitchen deliveries and been impressed by her dedication and intelligence. They needed help with farm operations and saw potential in the young woman's methodical approach to learning new skills. Dr. Foster arranged sponsorship for Keiko, helping her continue nursing training at a civilian hospital in San Francisco. Several medical facilities, desperate for qualified staff in the post-war period, were willing to overlook her enemy national status in exchange for her obvious competence and compassion. Harumi found sponsorship through a Japanese-American family, the Nakamuras, who had themselves been released from internment camps only months earlier. They understood firsthand what it meant to be seen as the enemy by your own country, and offered to help Harumi navigate the complex process of building a new life in America. The 24 women who chose repatriation prepared for their journey with mixed emotions. They were not returning in defeat, but as ambassadors of an unexpected reconciliation. They carried letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at Camp Stoneman, and most importantly, a different understanding of what former enemies could become when shown basic human dignity. The final day of departure in late October 1945 was unlike any prisoner of war repatriation in American history. The scene resembled a community farewell rather than a military processing operation. Tears were shed on both sides, genuine embraces exchanged between former enemies who had become something approaching friends. Sergeant Martinez presented Yuki with a complete handwritten cookbook containing every recipe they had worked on together. "So you don't forget," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. She clutched it like a precious treasure, promising to honor his teaching by sharing these skills with others. Private Murphy gave Keiko a small wooden cross his grandmother had carved, not as religious conversion but as a symbol of the kindness that had first broken through her fear. She accepted it with deep bows of gratitude, tucking it carefully into her bag. Captain Wheeler addressed both groups, those leaving and those staying, with words that acknowledged the extraordinary nature of what had happened. You came here as our enemies. You leave as proof that even the deepest hatreds can be overcome through simple acts of human decency. May you carry that lesson forward wherever your paths lead. Years later, historians would study this small group of Japanese women prisoners who chose transformation over return, redemption over resentment,